It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Pim van Lommel, and we're going to be discussing his excellent book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience. Pim, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
You're welcome to.
Well, I've been looking forward to finally making this interview happen. We had connected a while back and I had to reschedule. And so I'm glad we're finally making this happen in the new year. But I'm going to assume that many of my audience are meeting you for the first time. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Pim van Lommel origin story. So for somebody meeting you for the first time, give them a little bit of context for you.
Well, okay. I was born in 1943. I went to a family of 4 children. My father was an MD as well. And I went to university in Utrecht studying medicine. First doubting if I would study physics or medicine, but it became medicine and then cardiology, which has a lot of physics in it as well. And I finished my specialization in cardiology in 1967. 76, 76. And I went to Arnhem in a hospital working on a cardiology firm. And that when cardiology started, because you have to remember that in the 60s, cardiology was just specialization for congenital heart disease and heart valve disease. But in the end of the 60s, 67 to 69, heart catheterization started, bypass surgery started, PTCA started, pacemaker started, new medication started, whatever. Echocardiography, rhythm disturbances, treatment, etc. So I had the privilege to see the whole evolution of cardiology from the start until I retired in 2003 at the age of 60, because then I published an article in the Lancet about near-death studies, and I had decided 70 hours a week cardiology, 50 hours a week for near-death experience, and I started to stop cardiology to create a full-time job about near-death experience and the mind-brain relationship.
And I was intrigued reading your book that George Ritchie's story had such an impact on you. A lot of people who've read Dr. Moody's work as well have heard him reference George. I think in several of his books. So I'm curious for you, when you encountered Dr. Ritchie's story, like what did that do for you? It clearly sets you on a trajectory that has dramatically impacted your life.
Yes, I read his book in 86, and you can read it in several hours. But I was so intrigued and impressed with it because he died as a medical student in 1943 because of a double pneumonia, and there were no antibiotics available. So he died, was declared death, and his body was covered with a sheet. And there was a nurse who was so upset that his medical student died that was able to persuade a doctor to give him an injection of adrenaline right into his heart, which was quite uncommon in those years. And after a period of death of 9 minutes, he regained consciousness. And had trouble to find his body back. So, but he saw a hand beside the sheet where it was his fraternity ring on. So he just thought, this must be my body under it. He had a very deep near-death experience, but all the aspects you can imagine, all the elements you know from the book from Moody, etc. I can mention if you want to. But and then he, as a he went to Normandy and was one of the first people who entered concentration camps. And what he saw there, I was so impressed by it. There was a man in a concentration camp when everybody was dying or dead. And there was a man from Poland who was helping the people to find if there were still family members alive. And this man was healthy and alive. And he asked, how many weeks are you here? He said, I'm 4 years here now. I said, I lived in Warsaw and I had to get out of my house with my whole family. In front of my eyes, they shot my wife and children. And I had a choice. I can start to hate or can start to love. And I started to love. And because of this loving energy, he survived the camp and he was still helping people. and was so surprised and impressed by this story as well, and by the story of the NDE, that I just started to interview patients who survived a cardiac arrest in my hospital. I first heard the first story in 1969, just when the coronary care unit started, because modern resuscitation CPR was possible with the external defibrillation and external chest compression. And I was working in the second coronary care unit in the Netherlands, and we had a young man who had a cardiac arrest, and we resuscitated him with several defibrillations. And after a period of 4 minutes, he became conscious, and we were so happy as a resuscitation team. I was the doctor in charge. And the patient was so extremely disappointed that he was back, and told him about going through a tunnel, seeing a light, landscape, music, etc. And I never forgot this event, but I never did anything with it. I just started my specialization at a young family, etc. But now, after reading the book by George Ritchie, I just was intrigued and started to interview patients. And within 2 years, from 86 to 88, I had 50 patients who asked them if they had memories from the period of unconsciousness, from the period of cardiac arrest. And 12 of these 50 patients shared the NDE with me. And that was the moment that I was just said, well, I have learned in university that consciousness is a product of brain function. So it should be impossible that patients can have an enhanced consciousness with memories. It's a possibility of perception out and above the body, meeting deceased relatives, seeing a being of light, life review, or future events of their life. That should be impossible at all. So we're asking these questions, looking for our answer. We started a prospective study in 1988 in 10 Dutch hospitals to see if we could find an explanation for the cause and content of the near-death experience, because it should be impossible, according to our current materialistic approach about consciousness and the brain. That's how it started.
Well, and I'd love to get your perspective in terms of, whether we're talking traditional medical training when you were coming up and starting out versus medical training today. Why is it difficult for doctors to accept NDEs? And I feel like to some degree that's changing in the sense that the conversation in this space is so much more prevalent than it was in past decades. But what's the difficulty there to deal with that?
Well, it's a very easy problem. We have learned the dogma that consciousness is part of the brain function, and still most neuroscientists around the world are looking in the brain to find consciousness. And they have the research money for this research as well. They have the positions in university to do this research. They have still the materialistic approach. And so they're frightened. They're frightened that they should be wrong. They're frightened that everything they have said and written down and doing the research should be wrong. So they're very reluctant to be open. I know some professors who tell, firstly, you could be right, but officially they said it's total nonsense until they retire. Then they said, it should be the other way around than I've thought and said before. But our materialist world is still based on materialism, which is materialist science is based on objectivity, that you can prove, that you can measure, that you can duplicate, and that you can falsify. And then it is true. But the problem is that what you think and what you feel, the content of your consciousness, you cannot prove, you cannot measure, you cannot duplicate, you cannot objectify. So that's the problem for most materialist scientists as well. So consciousness is beyond current materialist science. It doesn't exist at all. It's just an illusion. And when your brain stops functioning, it should be impossible to experience consciousness, let alone enhanced consciousness, much more consciousness than we normally have as we are sitting now here.
And I'd be curious to hear.
But another thing is that I'm positive as well. I think the younger generation is much more open. I've given lectures to medical students, university, medical schools, hospitals, hospices, etc. And the younger generation is much more open than my generation. And also Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, has once said, a new idea is don't try to let it accepted by the old generation. Wait until they die, and the younger generation will open to it and accept it as normal.
Well, and I'd also like to hear in terms of you starting to ask your patients about did they have a near-death experience? Like, what was the shift for you? Because I feel like if we're willing to have these conversations with patients or people who've had these experiences, and we have more of these conversations, it puts us more in a position to be empathetic and be more open, and we kind of see these people in a different light. If you contrast before you started talking to the patients about these to after, was there a shift you had to undergo to start having those conversations?
I just had one question. That is, do you have memories from periods of unconsciousness? Do you have memories of periods of your cardiac arrest? And then the answer was no, or why? When they had why, then they sit there for more than an hour. So it was my scientific curiosity to ask questions. And it took several years before I could accept that what I've learned on the university was wrong.
And I'll say one of the things I was delighted that you include early on in the book is you have various frameworks kind of that help us process sort of the structure of a traditional near-death experience from whether it's Moody or Grayson or Ring or others. In terms of having kind of the framework of what to expect or how those roll out, why is it important for us to be able to think through these experiences in that sort of a context?
Well, I think the problem is, the challenge is that people who have an NDE, it's an ineffable experience. There are no words for it. They're trying to find words for it. And then when they try to put it into words, it's helpful to have the kind of elements. So the most universal elements is that, first of all, that they realize, is this death? Am I dead or not? And then they can have the possibility of perception out and above the body. They see their own lifeless body during CPR, during surgery. And then they come in a dark space, which can be sometimes frightening as well. And then they see a small light where they're attracted to, and then they describe it as a tunnel. And then they come into the light with unconditional love and acceptance, and an unworldly landscape with beautiful colors, beautiful trees, beautiful music, and meeting deceased relatives. And you can see your life, you live your life again. It's the life review. So you're connected. You connect consciousness of others in the past as well. You know exactly what was wrong and what was right. There's no condemnation. It's just an insight in how you should live and what you do to others, how it will come back to yourself. And sometimes they have future events as well. And then they come to a border. And they know, when I pass this border, I will never come back. And then usually they hear a voice who said, it's not your time yet. You have still a task to fulfill. And then they have a conscious return to the body, which is awful for them, especially we had a traffic accident where everything was broken, etc. A lot of pain. So they're not happy at all to be back in the body as well. And they say, my consciousness is so enlarged that it does not fit anymore in my body.
Yes.
So these are the elements. And I think it's helpful to put these kind of elements again when they try to talk about it. But not everybody has the same element. Let's say some have 3 or 4 elements, others have 4 or 5, 7 or 8 or 10 elements. And the more elements they recall, the deeper the NDEs is defined.
Well, and that brings up a follow-up question. Talk to us a little bit about kind of the scoring elements to kind of test that depth of an NDE. Depending on which framework we're talking about, some of them have kind of numerical values associated with the different kind of hallmarks or milestones along the framework, if you will. Why is that helpful?
There are a lot of people, also the Grayson scale, is that you have to at least 6 points to call it an near-death experience. And I think it's when you look at the general population, it's quite useful. But we're just doing prospective research, as we did in survivors of cardiac arrest. And also 1 or 2 elements are enough to call it a near-death experience, because we had 2 aspects of the study. We had 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest who were interviewed in the prospective study. And we had a longitudinal study with taped interviews 2 years and 8 years after the cardiac arrest, with questions about the transformation. And so we have a matched control group of patients with the same age, the same gender, and the same time interval, with and without an NDE, to see if the classical transformation, that is no fear of death anymore, new insight that was important in life, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity, is just a result of the cardiac arrest, or just a result of the NDE. What we found is only patients with an NDE had this classical transformation. Also, patients who had just one or two elements of the classical NDE had the transformation. So in our study, we included all patients, also with a lower score, because of the prospective design.
And in terms of this research space, conversational space, there are some people who have a near-death experience, but they don't clinically die. I mean, sometimes people are more of a coma state. Other times, I've interviewed people where they went to bed, there was nothing health-wise wrong with them, and they had a traditional near-death experience, really, in terms of all those normal milestones and some of those frameworks. What do we do with near-death experiences that aren't seemingly a result of, say, clinical death?
Yeah. Well, I think for science, it's important to study patients who survive the cardiac arrest, because we know for sure that the brain does not function anymore within 10 to 20 seconds. I'll come back to it later. So in critical medical situations, loss of blood in complicated childbirth, coma because of traffic accident, of brain hemorrhage, brain infarction, near drowning in children, then you have a problem with the brain function. But you can have the same kind of NE-like experiences. So an experience of enhanced consciousness in meditation, in isolation, shipwrecks, astronauts, Mitchell and Glenn had it, in depression of existential crisis, but just walking in nature as well. Also in the end of life experience can have the same kind of enhanced consciousness experience. And we call it the spiritual transformative experiences, the STE. So this includes all the experience of enhanced consciousness, which can happen also without any obvious reason. But for a scientific point of view, we want to discuss the mind-brain relationship, then study prospective studies on survivors of cardiac arrest is the only way to, let's say, to find out how it is.
I was glad also that you include a chapter talking about children who have near-death experiences. You don't see that in all of the books that are out there. I'd love to have
PMH Atwater has written about it as well. And it's an important chapter for me as well in practice, because I meet quite a lot of people who say, I have an enhanced sensitivity since younger age. Then I ask them, what about your childbirth? They say, well, it was very complicated. I was blue, I had to be resuscitated. I was coma when they were 1 year old. And then I explained to them that they must have had a near-death experience. And under the age of 5, you don't remember the experience, but you all have the transformation, especially the enhanced intuitive sensitivity. So this chapter is very hopeful. And I have meet hundreds of people each year when they write to me by email. It helps them to understand why they are different from other people and why they're different as a child.
And in terms of the kind of the hallmarks of the experience, how does a child's near-death experience, if they're able to remember it, how does it differ from what adults tend to experience?
But again, under the age of 5, you usually don't remember the content of the idea. Although I have met people like a man who remembered exactly his complicated childbirth, but he had the umbilical cord. He was blue. He saw 3 or 4 doctors. He saw his mother, and he could remember everything. And it was during a lecture I gave, and his mother was beside him, and she confessed that everything what he told exactly happened this way. But it's an exception. Usually it's near drowning, traffic accidents, etc., above the age of 5, that people can remember the NDE. and have the transformation. But when you are so young, you don't have a worldview as well. So when you have an adult, your worldview totally changes. But when you're a child, you don't have your materialistic worldview, because as soon as children go to school, talk to other people and talk to family members, then they are forced into a materialistic way of thinking. That's the problem with modern education as well.
And in terms of, I guess one follow up, and for say children to accept or process what they experience, I think in Dr. Long's work, he says it takes about 7 years for an adult to really process what they experience. Are children able to come to terms with an NDE a lot faster?
Well, they don't know that when they are very young, they don't know that they had an NDE, but they're different from other children. So they're silent. They're looking for other children who are playing. They like nature. They like classical music. They hate noise. And then at puberty, they can be very depressed and even suicidal, because then they become aware that they're different from other people. So there's not a change in worldview at all at that time. But when you're older, and also adults, the acceptance of the idea. Most people don't know what happened to them. It's a life-changing event, but they don't know that it has a name. They don't know there are other people who have the same kind of experiences as well. So as soon as they hear about it in a television program, or read a book about it, or hear someone talk to someone who's able to listen without any comment and prejudice, then they can start to accept it, and they know they're not the only one. And there's an organization like IANS. But the first years, it's a spiritual trauma. They are depressed, homesickness, and loneliness. And it takes many years to accept it. And then if they are able to accept it, then to integrate it into their daily life. And it will take 10, 20, 30 years. We once did a study in 82 patients who had an NDE with an interval between 7 months and 70 years, with a mean interval of 24 years when we interviewed them. And still half of them were not able to talk about the NDE after a mean interval of 24 years. So it's a trauma. I have met people who have been silent about the NDE for 50 years or more. So society is important, that they meet people that are open and can listen and accept it. And then they can start to accept it themselves. But it's hard work. It's not easy at all. The NDE is usually has a positive content, but being back in that materialistic society is hard work. It's a trauma.
And another place I was excited that you went in the book that was new to me is you talk about quantum physics and consciousness. I haven't seen this address. I've seen this brought up in a few of the books I've read, but not to the detail you go into. I'm curious for you, when did that emerge in your studies, and why is that important?
Well, first of all, I've always been interested in physics. As I told you before, I first wanted to study physics, and then it was cardiology with a lot of physics in it. I use quantum physics as an analogy and not as an explanation for consciousness. I mean, when you hear people talk about the consciousness, that everything is connected instantaneously, beyond time and beyond space. Everything is connected. Then you come to the concept of quantum physics, the entanglement. So in quantum physics, we know that everything is connected beyond time, beyond space, without beginning, without end. And that's exactly what people with an NDE tell us. So that's why I call it an endless concept of non-local consciousness, because it has no beginning, will never end. It has been before birth, it will be always be there after death. So I never also talk about life after death. I talk about the continuity of consciousness, because life is a biological principle. And when your body dies, it's the end of the biological principle. But your consciousness will continue. Consciousness is eternal. It will always be there. And it has always been there. And it is now also there when you're sitting and when I'm sitting here. It's mostly outside your body, but it's also inside your body. It's always everywhere.
And in terms of kind of the broadly the field of near-death experience studies, like are there untapped spaces for us to do research-wise, places we need to go? I feel like a lot of the emerging research is largely around consciousness. I'd love to hear from your perspective. What are the things we need to be digging into right now in this space?
I think the most important thing is there have been 4 studies, prospective studies about near-death experience in survivors of cardiac arrest. 2 studies from the UK about Sampania and Penny Sartori, and 1 study about Bruce Grayson in the USA. It's about including 562 survivors of cardiac arrest. I think that's enough. The problem is, the challenge is, how do we talk about this, the results of the studies and the conclusions of the studies? How can we implicate the studies into the medical schools? How can we implicate the studies into the general population? And I'm sure that the change in insight about consciousness and the mind-brain relationship will be by the general public, and not about the scientists. They are so reluctant and they are so frightened that it will take more time for them to accept it.
And big picture in terms of the reader's journey with this book, like what are the if they take away 1 or 2 things, or you impact them in a specific way, what do you hope every reader grasps from their time with this book?
Repeat your question, please.
Kind of the reader's journey with the book. Somebody does the time, they read all the way through the book. What's that takeaway? How do you hope you impact each reader?
I hope they will open and open to a new insight about the mind-brain relationship. To know that there's continuous consciousness, that the consciousness will never end. And usually people who are reading my book have had special conscious experience themselves. Let's see that in Europe, about 600,000 people in the Netherlands have had a near-death experience. About 20 million people in Europe have had a near-death experience. About between 10 and 15 million people in the USA have had a near-death experience. But when we talk about after-death communication, we have the inner feeling of inner knowing, to be in contact with the consciousness of a deceased relative. It's about 125 million people in Europe and 100 million people in the USA. And when I give lectures, I always ask the audience if they know someone with an NDE, if they have an NDE themselves. And then the third question is, who've ever had the inner feeling of knowing that you have been in contact with the concept of disease relative? 30 to 40% of the audience raises their hand. And that's why they sit there. So, when you have been in contact with the consciousness of deceased relatives, we have communication with them. Then it's only possible when you know that the consciousness is still there, somewhere, and you can in contact with them. And usually it happens during sleep. And they said, I have a dream about it, but it's not a dream. You never forget it. A dream normally you forget, but you never forget. And when you sleep, the threshold of consciousness is lower. So the deceased relative is more able to contact you in your waking consciousness.
And I'd love to hear any other books you'd recommend in this space. We've mentioned a number of different authors, but if somebody enjoys your book, give us 1 or 2 other books you think that would complement it well.
I think the book by Bruce Grayson is very important. A book by Peter Fenwick is very important, but also Stephen Schwartz about remote viewing. There's non-local perception. It's also about non-local consciousness. There's so many books. and also Bernardo Kastrup, who is a philosopher and physicist who has written about non-local consciousness and about the philosophical approach about it. There are so many books that are important. And I think it doesn't matter at all which book you read, as soon as you are open for it. And when you want to ask questions about it, read the references as well. And also in my book, there are 300 references. And my book from the Bigelow Institute, there are about 300 references, all based on peer-reviewed articles and books. So I think it's important. But usually it starts by having an experience yourself. And then curiosity starts.
Well, and I haven't had an experience myself, but I have lots of friends and authors I've worked with through the years who have, and so that's what set me down this path. My joke when I get together with a group of NDEers is I always joke and say all my friends have been to heaven, and all I got was the T-shirt. So that's how we make light of that. Pim, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out about the book, how do we discover you on the web?
Well, there's a website, and you can call www.pimvanlommel.nl or www.consciousnessbeyondlife.com. You can read my book, Consciousness Beyond Life, or my Bigro article. There are a lot of scientific articles to be found in my website as well, interviews, lectures, YouTube films, whatever. So there's a lot of information available by my website as well.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the show notes and the description to Pim's website, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of his excellent book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Pim van Lommel. Once again, our book today was Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience. And Pim, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
You're most welcome.